Welcome to the state of Ohio. I'm Karen Kessler. The 3C&D plan is back. Nearly a half a century after the 3C corridor between Cleveland and Cincinnati was last used for passenger trains, and 12 years after a plan was derailed by Republican former Governor John Kasich. The bipartisan infrastructure plan passed last year includes an $80 billion federal investment for passenger rail. And Amtrak has announced that one of the projects could be another crack at creating a train system for passengers that goes from Cleveland to Columbus to Dayton to Cincinnati, with other stops along the way. And while it would still take 5.5 hours to make the full trip that takes 4 hours by car, and that's too long for many, Amtrak says the expansion could bring in 500,000 riders with an annual economic impact of nearly $130 million. I sat down with two advocates for the proposal to talk about some of the specifics. The federal infrastructure plan last year included $67 billion for passenger rail. Last spring, Amtrak announced one project would be the long-discussed 3C&D corridor connecting Cleveland to Columbus to Dayton to Cincinnati. Let's get some specifics on what this would look like. Straight shot, express, or would there be stops, several trains throughout the day, return trips the same day? What can you tell us?
Well, it's a vision. It's not a plan. And our vision was at least 3 round trips between Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati via my hometown. My mom wants me to say that, Dayton. And we estimated about 500,000 people would ride it to start. We estimated a travel time of about 5.5 hours, which gives you a chance to be productive and do everything on a train that you shouldn't do while driving, like reading, sleeping, working, doing texts, and do it in a way that uses existing infrastructure being upgraded, not mowing down people's houses and businesses. That conversation, which we had a year ago spring, helped get Congress to where we are now with the biggest and best federal operating and capital support to build more rail networks, freight and passenger, than we've ever had.
And I understand there's a funding deadline coming up. If Ohio's corridor is selected, this corridor is selected, when would the first trains actually start launching potentially?
We're a couple years from that. The first thing that has to happen is all across the country, people are looking at raising their hands and telling the Federal Railroad Administration to look at this corridor, look at that corridor, or look at something that MORPC has been very interested in, which is Pittsburgh, Columbus, Fort Wayne, Chicago. Once the feds have all of those expressions of support, they're going to look at that and see basically which ones are the best to start off with. And we're not going to know the answer to that until sometime late next spring. And then more federal money will be available to actually do real hardcore studies about what it would take, what the railroad needs to have done to it for trains to be driving time competitive. So we're a ways off from my mom buying a ticket to visit me in Chicago, but it's within reach, and it's the best ever federal operating support and the best ever federal capital support that we've seen in the more than 51 years of Amtrak.
Thea, at MORPC, you are not just focused on the 3C&D corridor. There are other possible routes statewide, and I imagine that is potentially to bring more economic development, to maybe even minimize environmental impact.
Absolutely. So Central Ohio is growing substantially, and we see that out to 2050, and we've seen that in the most recent economic development announcements. And so supporting that and having a service like this of a first world city, first class city in Columbus, Ohio, we have to bring these options to the public that we're growing, right? They're expecting that. So that's what we're trying to drive. And then through that, we would like to also see those connections not only to Cleveland and Cincinnati, but over to Chicago, on up to Detroit and into Canada. There is a potential here for Columbus to be a rail hub. They are currently not on the map. Having 2 lines would make them a hub, and we would like to see more than 1 line.
But 400,000 potential riders. I mean, I'm wondering.
3 round trips.
Oh, I'm sorry?
3 round trips.
Well, I'm wondering, when you talk about these people who want to see passenger rail service here, does what you'll be able to provide match with what they want? I mean, multiple arrival and departure times, quick trips, stops they want, reasonably priced, these sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is the potential to do that, especially with the investment that's being made by the federal government and the potential to partner with the private sector on this. So there is opportunity to go beyond three trips a day and to bring up those frequencies, but you have to start somewhere. Amtrak has to build a business case for us. Now, they have a great lead in the fact that we're a great place to come to, but the next part is they have to get here and practice it. And the only way they practice that is by doing that about 3 times a day, and then they'll know, maybe we need to be 7, maybe we need to do more stops, but we're here and we get that service off the ground. That's the most important part.
And not just Columbus. I mean,
right.
As Thea said, we're talking to folks in Toledo and Cleveland. We're talking to folks in Cincinnati. Right now, we pass through northern Ohio in dark of night. Unless you happen to be really wanting to ride, and we appreciate everybody who rides out of our Cleveland station or Sandusky or Toledo, we're not there in light of day. Imagine if you had a better choice than the Turnpike across northern Ohio. That's doable. Imagine a better way to get from Cleveland to Buffalo to New York City, or from Toledo to Detroit from Cleveland, or on to Chicago. Those are the 160 places we've talked about that need more service. And that's doable. There's models all over the country. We run 5 trains a day between Chicago and St. Louis, and there's plenty of people who say that's not enough. 3 is a starting point. And that travel time of about 5 hours plus is a starting point, not the end point.
In 2010, the race for governor featured a lot of discussion about this project, $400 million in federal funding to bring the 3 C&D corridor to Ohio. Then he was running for governor, John Kasich, claimed that this project would cost all this money and would have an average speed of 39 miles an hour, and it would take 6.5 hours to go from Cleveland to Cincinnati. ODOT disputed that in a report and said that there were some things that could be done differently, and the trip would actually be closer to 5 hours and 15 minutes. The average travel time would be 50 miles an hour. What's different now, 12 years later, from that project that got rejected essentially by incoming Governor John Kasich and what you're talking about now?
Well, firstly, there's more federal money to make the railroad faster. And every mile an hour we save, or minute we save off of that time, not only helps those people who are riding those trains, it helps every freight shipper on that route. By improving the railroad, you're improving it for both passenger and for freight. And last I heard, people want the supply chain to work better. So let's say that this lays a big egg, that nobody rides it. Even at the end of the period, you're going to have an improved railroad diagonally across Ohio, potentially east and west across the top of Ohio. And by doing it this way, the feds have said they're going to pay 90 cents on the dollar after the fare box to pay for the service. The program wasn't that good back during the time you're citing. So it'll have a chance to prove itself. You'll end up with better railroad, and it'll have a chance to build a business case that people can see what works in Illinois, what works in California, what works in Michigan can work here in Ohio.
Now, in the idea of seeing Amtrak and passenger train service as public transit, this legislature hasn't been too friendly to public transit. Public transit got $140 million in the last 2-year budget. Highway spending got $5.6 billion. So how do you deal with a legislature and a governor, potentially, that may not want to spend this money? Because as I understand it, there's going to be a bill that the state's going to have to pay to maintain this property once the first couple of years of full funding run low.
We have to build a business case, and because the way this is structured, with big federal funding at the beginning and lower federal funding, you can walk away from this at some time as the money on the state side gets higher. But having 80 cents on the dollar to improve the railroad coming from the feds, having 90 cents on the dollar to pay for the service coming from the feds, gives it a chance to succeed or fail. You're never probably going to have, at least in the 51 years there's been Amtrak, a program as good as this to try it. And again, if it doesn't work, you're still left with greatly improved freight railroad for the rest of your supply chain. It's not like, they're going to come by and pull the tracks and the rails up and the ties. And in fact, when you invest in railroad improvement, that lasts a lot longer than highway improvement. 10 or 15 year, 20-year lifespans for improving the railroad versus highways, and I use them all the time. I used one today to come here. Putting a couple inches of blacktop over the concrete every couple of years. You're doing that every couple of years. When you invest in the railroads, you have a much longer lifespan. for the quality of that investment.
Well, and you had asked about transit in the state of Ohio and the support of it. I would say, over the last couple of years, the legislature, we've been fortunate to maintain this. They've actually did an increase in transit funding in the state of Ohio back a couple of years ago. We've been able to maintain that and be able to use that for transit across the state. Now, rail transit's a whole other bag of worms. That's considered regional. So they haven't ever played in that field. But I think the step they've taken with transit in the past already shows there's an interest, because those transit services connect to these services. We have to have them first in order to have these. So we're making those steps. I feel like we're on our path, and certainly this is the next optimal step. So hopefully they'll want to take it.
Do you think, though, that you have to convince people that rail travel is still that important leg here? I think a lot of people think of rail travel as in the past, and that they like their cars, they like the highways, they like airline travel. They just don't see rail travel as being something that they want to do.
If you have likable highways, you are in a very different place than most other places in this country. I'll say that the Ohio DOT must be having likable highways
I
out
think
there.
it's more the cars that people like as opposed to the highways.
Oh, well, I just wanted to make sure I was not misunderstanding, because I came over here on I-70. I didn't see a lot of smiles. But look, the fact is that people are looking for better choices, and people are looking for other choices. And people need to look beyond the state border to see success stories. In California, which supposedly is a very car-centric state, we can't add trains fast enough to meet the demands in California. Between Chicago and Milwaukee, where we run about 7 trains every day, up and back, 7 round trips, we were pushing 900,000 customers pre-pandemic. 900,000. And some of those trains were getting to be standing room only. Now, will all the business travel come back? Who knows? But certainly family travel, certainly recreational travel, certainly hospital travel to go to big hospital centers, whether it's here, Dayton, Cincinnati, or Columbus, all of that's really important to people. My mother is never going to drive from Dayton to Columbus, much less Cincinnati or Chicago. Having choices for people, having people using existing and improved infrastructure, once you have it, and once you see how it works, and I'd invite anyone to come visit us in any of our stations across the 46 states that Amtrak operates in, and see how important it is in those cities. Even if we're only there once a day, it's a big deal, because people need choices. People want choices. Not everybody should drive. Not everybody can.
So I have something to that. You had mentioned California. I was recently talking to a colleague in San Francisco, and they in Tracy, California, which is outside of Palo Alto, where Apple and Google are at. And they've had to add a train from this area out to Palo Alto, and it is standing room only. These are high-tech jobs, very similar to the Intel-style jobs. And it is filled, this train is filled with the types of people who work in those jobs that need to travel more than 60 minutes for work. And tell me about an experience we're going to have in the state of Ohio where that could possibly be a legitimate concern of ours.
And trains are far from the past. I mean, look at the Northeast. Amtrak carries more customers between New York and Washington than all the airlines combined. And we're pretty close to carrying more than half of them between Boston and New York. Even between Chicago and St. Louis, where there are more flights than there are Amtrak trains, we're about a third of all the travel between us and airlines. So people don't want to ride, in a lot of cases, in little regional jets with little seats and your knees against your mouth and someone sitting next to you like this, when a train can do it. And when trains do it at places like the Milwaukee Airport, BWI Airport, Burbank Airport, Newark Airport, we're the last mile for people to get from that airport to their town. And you don't have to drive and park and spend all that money. So whether we're feeding airports, or whether we're feeding downtowns, or whether we're feeding business and industry, it works really well. All you have to do is look beyond what you've had. And unfortunately, Columbus has not had service since 1979. Service on the 3C and a D was lost in the mid-60s. So you need to see beyond what maybe some people are telling you, which is no one rides it anymore, because they ride it.
And finally, do we have any estimates on how much after that first 3 years of federal funding that it might cost to maintain the 3C&D corridor here in Ohio?
Well, that's what we're driving toward. Once you're in the queue, once you raise your hand and say, we want to be considered, the next step will be much deeper studies about how much really needs to be spent, what's the current state of affairs. Remember, these ridership estimates took place when gasoline was $2 and $3 a gallon, not 4, 5, and 6, right? And I've not seen 6 in Chicago lately. I've seen around the upper 3s, around 4 here now. But each time you get to a pinch point for gas prices, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, people start looking for other choices. And for a lot of places, and we'd like it to be more, Amtrak's a great choice.
Is there, the estimate in 2010 was about $17 million to maintain it. Is that still possible, or is that inflated dramatically because of all different things that have inflated in 12 years?
Numbers change, and the freight railroads have some different operating practices than they had then. Right now, the freight railroads are running freight trains that are 2 and 3 miles long. Miles. So when that freight train's going across the crossing, you see one locomotive or 2 or 3 at the front, one in the middle. You might as well turn the car off and wait a while longer because there's a lot more train behind them. So we have to see how the coast railroads are using their railroads today versus then. Are they running more of these, running less? Coal traffic certainly isn't now in 2022 what it was back then. So we need to see that, but in order to see it, you need to be in line to say you want it.
Well, and to that point, we've had a great experience in talking with the Michigan legislature. We were on board a train where Amtrak actually shared with them the service that they've done there, and they were able to explain how they've actually been able to bring down the cost of the maintenance over time by continually improving that line. So we're seeing Amtrak do this in other places in the United States where they may start at a certain number, but over time, because the increase in the service, ticket prices or tickets go up because of interest and the speed goes up, that means the operating cost actually goes down.
Because the ticket agents get paid the same whether they're servicing 5 trains, 3 trains, or 20 trains, right? Hourly employees on Amtrak trains, which do a great job, one that I could never even try to do, are paid hourly. So the shorter the train runs in time, the more value you get out of each employee. So there's plenty of ways to drive the cost down. The Midwestern states of Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, and Wisconsin have bought their own rail equipment, which they own and we run for them, which is another way of driving down costs. So there's ways to get there.
And last question, what kind of support is there beyond just the people at this table for this project?
Yeah, I think there is a lot. You know, I've talked to a number of businesses, one in downtown right here on the Capitol Square who was working with a building owner, and the building owner was shocked to find out that his property wasn't served by rail. So that was, it was like, why not? Of course, right? So we're hearing from businesses more than ever that they're interested. Also through various state associations, we're hearing that, other cities would be interested.
What about chambers of
supporting
commerce and partnerships?
Yep, partnerships, chambers of commerce. I've not only talked to those in Columbus, but have had conversations with my colleagues across the state in similar level positions and at chambers and partnerships. We're really just trying to determine and work with the state to determine what the next steps are for them, and that will help us determine what our next steps as a group is.